My name is Frank Furedi, and what I'm really interested in doing is to question the role of evidence-based policy, particularly in education, mainly because it tends to often give promises that are very rarely realized. It distracts teachers from taking themselves seriously and using their own judgment. Often the evidence is based on methodologies that are foreign to education and are therefore quite inappropriate. And I hope that perhaps what we can think about is not get obsessed about what works in evidential terms, but much more begin by asking the question, what is it that children need to know? Good morning, everybody. My name is Frank Furedi, sociologist by profession, interested in the sociology and the cultural dynamics within the educational sphere. The last talk ended with a kind of a rogues gallery of all the bad people that you're likely to encounter. I'm probably even worse than they are. I kind of feel like I'm the Antichrist that has come to the first supper of the Lord, sort of. But I've got very good reasons, I think, for raising doubts about the evidence sort of obsessed focus in education. I'm a big believer in educational research. I've been involved in that myself. I have many PhD students who have been involved in educational research. I'm a big fan of Pierre Bourdieu, who carried out one of the most impressive research projects that I know of. But nevertheless, what I'm really worried about is the compulsive turn of Western societies, particularly Britain, towards the evidence. I mean, these days, you cannot hear a politician opening their mouth without saying the evidence shows. Research says. Cameron or Clegg or Miliband will never say that a policy is good or bad. They will never use the evaluative, normative language of either ethics or morality. No, evidence shows. Now, you don't need to have a PhD in social theory to understand that evidence is actually not what it appears. And that although evidence is very useful for researchers, for policymakers, it is very rarely the case that evidence directly leads to practical consequences. In fact, the really difficult problem that teachers face, academics face, ordinary human beings face, is first of all deciding the value of the evidence, because the evidence of nothing is nothing. Value of the evidence. Secondly, interpreting what that evidence means, contextualizing it, seeing it within its particular historical moment, and most important of all, if I was a teacher in a classroom, the question that I would be interested in is, what is the meaning? Right. Teaching, to me, is really meaning work. We're working at giving meaning to the everyday experience, to the relationships that we kind of construct with one another. And I think evidence has very little to say and to provide us. It's not an argument against it, but it just kind of poses its limits. It seems to me that one of the problems that we face today is that in an age where social theory, ideology, morality seems to be emptied of meaning, when we really find it very difficult to make sense of the worlds that we're confronting, we're tending to endow science with properties that are actually quite illegitimate. I'm a big believer in science. I'm a person who's 120% in favor of the Enlightenment. I think science has transformed and changed the world for the better. I am against the way that science has been inappropriately exported into other domains of social experience. I've written quite extensively about the spurious quality of the science of parenting. I mean, the first time I met a scientist of parenting was a bunch of nuns in Glasgow, who actually, never had to confront the challenge of changing somebody's nappy, right? Of dealing with the yells and the shouts, of dealing with angry teenagers. But nevertheless, they were talking about the science of parenting. We have the science of relationships now. We have people who talk about the science of sex, sort of, which is a weird idea, but nevertheless, there's a science for virtually everything now. And what's happened is that in the absence of any other dominant interpretive ways of making sense of the world, we tend to turn science not into what it is, a wonderful, open-ended, experimental orientation to the world that's continually yielding to new experience, we've turned science into scientism, a kind of quasi-sacred religious dogma that somehow must always have the last word, which is why these days when you open up a newspaper, every day I will bet you'll find the mantra, research shows. Have you ever heard that? Research shows. It shows nothing, actually. But nevertheless, that is the argument. Now, unfortunately, because of the problems that are meant to occur in education, we've taken the evidence and the science kind of driven agenda wholeheartedly. So, for example, we now are talking about, as the previous speaker talked about, randomized trials, introducing randomized trials into education. I think myself that the problem with this enterprise is twofold. First of all, it doesn't work, and I'll explain that later on. But secondly, more fundamentally, because there are many things that don't work, right? That you know from your own experience, but you got to do the ticking the box and everything. It doesn't work, but even more importantly, it distracts teachers from the real challenges that they face. And actually, I would suggest, despite its best intention, and these guys are really well, they're just like the missionaries in Africa who wanted to save Africans from themselves. So these, so too, they really do think that they're doing a wonderful job. Unfortunately, this orientation towards evidence actually distracts teachers from genuine experimentation, learning to develop the skills of cultivating their judgment, exercising professional judgment, which is really critical to be a good teacher and to get to be an even better teacher, because at the end of the day, your intuition as a teacher has got to be continually evolving and developing in light of new experience. But most of all, it degrades the enterprise of education. And that's not an accident that RCTs come from medicine. And let me say, first of all, I'm a wholehearted supporter of RCT in medicine. Randomized trials in medicine, great. I don't want to take drugs that somebody said, oh, Frank, this is wonderful. My son really enjoyed it. Here it is, right? That's not what I want to do, right? So I'm a real big believer in randomized trials in domains where it's pertinent. What I'm questioning as a social scientist and also as somebody who's worked on this area is that it's always dangerous to take a methodology that's integral to one field of science, and in this case medicine, and a few other kind of scientific domains, and to take those kind of methodologies into another domain. Call me narrow-minded, I'm a believer that pedagogical research has got to be organic and integral to the project, the enterprise of pedagogy itself. I take seriously works on mathematics or on reading or on linguistics that actually emerge. One of the biggest problems that we have in education, and too many teachers lack the confidence to question it and to come up against it, is that virtually every innovation and fad in the recent era has been motivated by cultural pressures outside of education. I mean, I know as a university lecturer that almost all the bullshit that we've been sort of subjected to comes from business studies. I mean, it's all business studies stuff. Everything, all the processes that we live by, best practice, I mean, have you got best practice in your school? All these, the language and the whole procedure, it didn't emerge from my classroom in the course of a lecture where a student challenged me and I was said to myself, oh yes, well, I better go away and think about it. No, it comes via the Harvard Business Review or some other thing that kind of comes in, and we've continually been dominated by that. Why should medicine be any better? I mean, why should we, doctors are great, they're great healers, but they are not involved in the practice of teaching or pedagogy. Why should we take their methodology as being okay? But it's worse than that. See, and probably you're going to disagree with me on this, because the number of debates I've been involved in, I had a huge row with some people involved in pedagogy. One of the problems with RCTs, and the whole premise behind it, is that it's based upon a very simple idea that equates a child that we're teaching with a patient. I mean, RCTs are oriented towards telling what works best with patients. And the analogy that people use who support RCTs is that children are a bit like patients. And in fact, Ben Goldacre himself in his document argues every child is different, of course, and every patient is different too. But we are all similar enough that research can help find out which interventions will work best overall, which strategies should be tried first, second, or third to help everyone achieve the best outcome. Now, the interesting thing here is, number one, the analogy between a child and a patient. In other words, the deficit model of education, kind of you assume that children have got these deficits that got to be put right. That's your starting point. But secondly, and I think, maybe I'm Foucaultian, even though I don't think I am, I do think there is something insidious about the language, and it was used this morning again, of interventions. I don't think teaching is a form of intervention, right? Intervention is what you do with drug addicts, when the whole family gets together, holds their hands, and tries to put something right. Intervention is what you do when you have a number of sick patients and you're trying to desperately find ways of curing them. And when I go into my lecture hall at the university, or when occasionally I teach in a class, I'm not intervening, right? I'm actually teaching, teaching, educating. That's what I'm doing. And that's not a small difference. There's a difference between a teacher who teaches a child and a doctor who cures and heals a child. Right? There's a very important difference. And it seems to me that we, in a way that's totally unaware of the situation, we import into education a deficit-based form of teaching. There's an assumption that children, when they arrive in the classroom, are actually not ready to learn. There's an assumption that your main job in the first instance is to put right this problem. In other words, the pathologization of the classroom, I think, is the foundation of this approach. And it seems to me that that meshes in quite well with the overall culture, the overall pedagogic and intellectual culture that exists within British society at the moment. A very good example, or maybe even an extreme example of what I'm talking about, was brought to our attention earlier this week. I don't know if you looked at the idiom of intervention in the way that it was used by the Center for Social Justice. I don't know if you saw the report that was published on Monday, where basically they talk about an army of underclass children starting schools, still wearing nappies and behaving like toddlers. And the image is, and when you talk to people on the street, you've got these little babies kind of coming along, they're kind of peeing in their pants, they can barely sit down, they're fidgeting all the time. And you and I know that there are children who may approximate that, but they are not the default child that we deal with in the schools. Actually, the wonderful thing, from my experience, is that when you meet 5, 6-year-olds, they kind of big eyes, they're ready to turn the world on fire. They're really ready to assimilate ideas, to internalize ideas. They're really bullshit in a very, very nice way at that particular time. And it seems to me that we're doing a lot of pathologizing, implicit pathologizing of children at a very, very early age by adopting this kind of orientation, which is not particularly helpful. So what I'm suggesting is that from this kind of idealization of an interventionist model of education, the child's deficits take a logical priority over the issues that children need to confront. If there is one phrase that I hate, and the Department of Education is using this all the time, and it's very common in pedagogic rhetoric, if there's one phrase that I hate, is this question of what works. Let's find out what works. And it seems to me that there's a very, it sounds plausible because obviously, we don't want to do things that don't work. We don't set out to sabotage our classroom. But the problem with this whole ideal of what works, of seeing what works as being so important, is that it actually distracts the attention of educators from the question of what children need to know. And one of my criticisms, certainly, of the way that curriculums have evolved through the Thatcher regime, through New Labour and the existing sort of regime, is that increasingly what works seems to acquire a momentum of its own, to the point at which issues that relate to a particular knowledge-based subject that are important, that are necessary to intellectually and academically challenge the child, becoming increasingly subordinated to the instrumental imperative of what works. In the Anglo-American pedagogic world, this is most grotesquely expressed through the education of relevance. And I remember a very good example of this that happened to me just 4 or 5 months ago when term was finishing. I was sitting in this really good school, high quality school, very proud of what works. And I met this wonderful Latin teacher, and she is really holding forth, about the importance of Latin, of the fact that it captures children's imagination. And this mother comes up to her and says, well, Mrs. So-and-so, I don't really care all that much about Latin. I'd rather my Jimmy knew about computer technology. And I thought it was a very interesting exchange because the confidence with which she flaunted computer technology, ever so relevant, ever so practical, going to give my child millions of jobs, against the face of a teacher who was taking her subject Latin seriously, to me really summarized the problem. Because it didn't have to be Latin, and it didn't have to be computer technology. It could be anything. But the problem is that if we adopt an entirely one-sidedly instrumentalized approach towards learning, then what happens is that what works becomes its own imperative. And we do begin to lose sight of what it is that we want our children to know. What is it that we want to understand? What is it about subjects, be it maths, literature, sciences, music, art, what is it about those subjects that are integral to it, that are important to teach the children? And that's really what we got to do. And once we begin to define for ourselves in every sector what is it that children need to know, then we can begin to engage in the enterprise of research and experimentation. And then at that point, a lot of the research questions become really quite important. It seems to me that one of the destructive consequences of the educational system in the way that it works at the moment is that we end up with a kind of processed education where, driven by the impulse of being certain that this is what works, what we tend to do is we rationalize what we teach. Now, pedagogy always involves an element of rationalization. As Pierre Bourdieu argued, we, through pedagogic experience, take out elements of experience that seem to hit the right buttons. And we tend to develop a kind of an approach through which, reflecting on our experience, we elevate certain insights. And they become integrated into the curriculum, they become integrated into our style. But the trouble with the rationalization of education is that whenever you rationalize education, whenever you turn education or bits of education into a process, you do run the danger of decontextualizing it. And you do run the danger of actually giving it a significance that is unwarranted. And it seems to me that what we have with the evidence-based approach is we turn what is perhaps a legitimate form of rationalization into hyper-rationalization. I thought it was very interesting that earlier on Ben was talking about producing research synopses of 3 paragraphs. Yeah. because that seems to me to be the emblem of the approach. You know, we give our teachers, you're a little bit thick, a little bit stupid, you haven't got a PhD in social theory and methodology. You know, for people like you, 3 paragraphs is sufficient. Well, let me tell you, 3 paragraphs of anything, whether it's the Bible or a summary of a research project, is not really worth the paper that it's written on. And the reason why is that all that it can do is give you abstract, decontextualized instructions. And I suspect that many of you in this room are getting more than your share of bits of paper with 3 paragraphs on it. You know, where you read the 3 paragraph, oh, I've done my bit, and you know, I can kind of tick the box and kind of move on. It seems to me that for that reason, we should avoid this kind of cultural turn for the very simple reason that it totally disorients the education system and prevents us from doing what we know best, which is learning through experience. Experience which is very specific and contextual. It also doesn't work. The reason why it doesn't work is because education is not really the same as producing McDonald's hamburgers. Education is not something that you ought to reduce into bite-sized chunks, which are all homogeneous and same. And the reason for that isn't because one is against hamburgers, but for the very simple reason that the educational experience is both subject to a wide variety of cultural influences, and it's also subject to fluid relationships within the classroom. So to get back to the question of what works, I always give my PhD student this book. It's written by a sociologist, Flavor of the Month, an American sociologist. It tells the story that when his child was 6 in California, you know, he went to the school and the teachers told him that all the research showed that you know, sort of kind of this form of reading sort of was the most effective, which was whole words and looking at pictures and various other kind of stuff like that. And therefore his child went through that educational experience. 7 years later, when his other boy was taken to school, the teacher said to him, new research has now conclusively demonstrated, absolutely demonstrated, without a doubt, that phonic type of reading is the one that works. And they were equally 100% certain about the claims that they were making. Now, I'm actually a pedagogic pluralist. I'm probably the only person in this room that actually believes that some teachers can teach reading really brilliantly doing phonics, and because that's who they are, that's what they should be doing. Other kind of teachers, you know, with very different dispositions, ought to do a different way. You know, they might do a different way of teaching reading. I've seen teachers adopting what would be denounced as terribly boring, essentially giving a lecture on Euclides in a mathematics class, but turning the class on fire. I mean, if I tried to give a lecture to mathematics students about Euclides, they would be asleep within 2 seconds. And even at the university level, and at the school level, we all know that what works for some teachers doesn't work for others. And therefore, we do have to bear in mind that we're talking about very subjective personal relationships, which is very different than in other domains of social experience, very different than in the realm of science. But also that the children that we teach are continually changing and evolving. And that what works with some children, to use an old expression, an effective way of engaging with some children passes other kids by. And therefore, we're continually struggling to develop the right kind of context. So context and cultural specificity is really, really important. An RC, a randomized trial, can simply tell us the results of what happens when you have 2 groups after a year. Well, it tells us that, but it doesn't tell us what's going to happen the year after, when children become influenced by the fact that there's an economic recession, that the parents have divorced, when a variety of other influences have kind of kicked in, when they get a new teacher who's very popular and turns the whole school on fire. It doesn't tell us what's going to happen then, which is why we find that almost every fad that's been introduced to pedagogy has proven to be of neutral value. It works in some cases, it doesn't work in other cases. And I think it's important for us to realize that there is a problem here of distinct contexts, which the evidence-based approach fails to tackle and to confront. It seems to me that the lesson that I would draw out from this is that instead of focusing on evidence and evidence-based policies, the really important kind of question that confronts the teaching profession is learning how to cultivate its own professional judgment, gaining the confidence to see itself, both professionally and individually, as the people who are in the best position to develop strategies for dealing with the classroom. Particularly important, which isn't happening in this country, where within each discipline, sort of there's a lot more work and experimentation going on to find out how we develop that subject in a way that's appropriate to our own specific circumstances. I would like to see teachers not being worried about the fact that they're not super researchers, but much more concerned about the fact that they could use a bit more education in their discipline, that they could use a bit more grasp of mathematics, literature, or science, or whatever it is that they're learning, because the more they know, the more likely they'll find ways of turning the classroom on fire. In particular, I think what I'm really arguing for is that what we need in education, and which research through evidence-based stuff isn't going to give us, is what Aristotle called the virtue of phronesis, of the capacity to judge, of making judgment calls. And it's only on the basis of the capacity to judge and making judgment calls that the really important research questions that really will matter will be forged. So that's my point, and I'm ready to receive your criticism. Over to you. Yeah.
Just to go back to what Ben Goldacre was saying about teachers being educated in terms of how the research is done and understanding how it's done so they can make up their minds about it. I don't think that hurts. I would agree with him on that. But I do agree with you that, the person who needs to inspire people needs to be educated in his or her own subject, and therefore finds the ways of. So I think you two are not talking against each other, but sort of looking at different points of the same thing, I hope.
Well, I agree with you up to a point, but except for with one reservation. There's a danger of fetishizing researchers, because I think that from my experience in the social sciences, and that includes education, a lot of researchers don't know their ass from their elbow. I mean, they are desperately struggling, and whenever I hear them talk about methodology, I always know that they're kind of hiding behind something, because a proud, confident researcher will flaunt their material in your face and will talk about it passionately instead of talking about the pi squares and this and that they've done. So I do think there's a problem which is to do with that research itself in this domain, not in the medical domain, is less than rigorous in many cases. Yes?
Just want to say thank you very much. I really enjoyed what you were saying. And I think for me the key thing is you're putting teachers back as being core to the whole process of education, and that what we need are excellent teachers and allowing them to be excellent in their own way. What would you say?
Yeah, and I think if you make a little leap from that, it's through teachers learning about what they've done and finding a language with which to express that the wider research issues, that really do matter, will come about, rather than artificially creating interventions. The chap in the back.
Frank, thank you, and really interested in the book, and I missed the name of the author. I got Flavour of the Month, but I didn't catch the name of the author.
Joel Best, yeah.
Say again?
His name is Joel Best.
Joel Best.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why do you think teachers lack, as a profession, lack the confidence in their own judgments? What do you think has led to that? To us being afraid to say, we're the ones dealing with the kid, this is what we think, this is how we think we should do it, rather than, what do you think's led to that?
I think what's led to that began in the late 1970s, where there's been a very powerful cultural sort of critique of professionalism, of professional judgment. And that's hit every domain of social experience, to the point at which, I still hear Margaret Thatcher saying, teachers need to be held to account. I mean, the idea that teachers were kind of hanging out, smoking dope, and sort of was the image. But the idea that you have to hold them to account was a very powerful one. And I think that meant that in a number of professions, that confidence was really eroded. But worse still, it's one thing to erode confidence, because that happens to all of us. It's another to make a virtue out of necessity. And I think that kind of passivity of teachers in relation to pedagogy has been enshrined over the last 20 or 30 years. It's not coming to the universities. I mean, we're not getting this stuff in the universities where, we're getting process squared in terms of everything. So it's happening all over, but the teaching profession is slightly more exposed because it's much more under public scrutiny, parent scrutiny and everything else. And you have to remember that in addition to that, part of this is to turn the parents against the teachers, it's to turn children against the teacher. I mean, the whole idea is that somehow, we have got to, keep them on their toes. It means that it's very difficult for teachers to really live their subjects with the passion that it requires, and to gain the intellectual confidence that they need to have in order to, sort of become masters of their own circumstances. Yeah.
I sort of get that you don't like the term intervention. I know it's very much in our lexicon at the moment. People talk about evaluating the impact of an intervention. What would you use then? What should we be talking about? Just pedagogical approach, different pedagogy?
I'm not a linguist, but it seems to me that we should just talk. Well, first of all, intervention is legitimate. For example, if you have some distressed children that need to be put right, that intervention is as a medical or a pastoral thing is quite legitimate. But my argument is that if you reduce education to that, then we do have a huge problem, because we then accept the deficit medical model of education, which means no education. It means that it becomes impossible. I think that the very fact that you asked that question is important, because you need to tell me, sort of what's the word that can most creatively sort of articulate that experience. And my argument is that at the moment, far too much of the language that you use and other teachers use and we use comes from another area, which is not a legitimate way of proceeding. Yeah.
Based on what you were saying about the dominance of dataism and scientism in educational debates, would you like to see education commentators refer more to morality and ethics, which you mentioned earlier in the speech, when putting forward arguments? Well,
I'm not a moralist. But I do think a normative language of evaluation is absolutely essential in education, and I know that we have problems in that department. There seems to be a lack of consensus about what norms ought to guide us, but that's all the more reason for us to argue about it and to debate, and with our students. I mean, one of the best ways of turning a classroom on fire is to have a discussion with them about values. I mean, they will really have very strong views, and I think we should be doing that a little bit more. But as teachers, the key thing that we should be concerned with is not so much morality or ethics, but the integral aspects of our subject. I mean, I think that's where England really falls down on. If I go to Belgium or if I go to China, the teachers there are into their subjects much more than we are. I mean, they love it. They kind of, it's inspirational to see a 22-year-old mathematics graduate, just kind of looking for different ways of teaching maths. It doesn't need me to come along and say this is what research shows. He's automatically, doing, sort of what you need to do, which is try to find the best way of teaching people the times tables or whatever you have to teach.
I'm afraid we're at time. So
Yeah, one more, yeah. Yes.
Yes. I picked up, oh, you always pick up what you know about when you listen to talks, and what I picked up about was when you started talking about teaching children to read, and you were talking about whole language and phonics. But you've also been talking about the importance of subject knowledge. And I do promote the teaching of phonics, but it's not just as a kind of, this is what I as an inspirational teacher think is right, it's because it's a body of knowledge. Because that one is a sort of vague idea. So I'm saying that there are differences, it's not just due to the teacher. Phonics is saying that our written language depends on understanding how sounds are represented by letters. It's a very specific subject thing, not just a sort of, let's see how we teach.
Yes, well, I mean, if you ask me, do I want my son to be taught by phonics? Yes, I would, for the reason that you suggest. But I also recognize that sometimes, and I've seen teachers use a different approach, which I don't think is, what I think is effective, nevertheless do really wonderfully. And the point I was really trying to get at is that there is I hate to use the word because we talk about science, there's an element of art to teaching. Even at university, there's an element, a lecture is a performance, isn't it? I mean, when you teach, you're kind of partially performing. So there are different ways of skinning the cat, and I think we should be open to that, regardless of what any...
I think what I'm saying is that I completely agree with that, but it's about the subject.
I agree with you. I think the subject is key, yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you very